Okay, welcome to the fourth lecture in our series. This one is really a continuation of the last lecture, and you can see that, of course, in that it shares the same name. We're talking about trends in drug use, and by trends in drug use, I mean just rates of use of different drugs among different populations in America and how those rates have changed over time. It's a whole set of fascinating questions. Last time we focused mostly on young people, especially people who are high school aged. Today we're going to focus a little bit more on older folks, including college-age students, especially college-age students' use of alcohol, but we're also going to discuss some other types of drugs that really didn't get a lot of attention last time, including the misuse of prescription medications, a topic I've mentioned before, but which certainly deserves a little bit more attention today. So, okay, trends in drug use. I've kind of already explained where we're going with this, so let's just get started. Now, last time, as I said, we focused a lot on young people, and you may be wondering, well, what about other ages of folks? What about people who are adults or middle-aged folks or even older folks? Now, we know, of course, that rates of drug use have changed over time for young people, meaning high school folks. The Monitoring the Future survey gives us a lot of information about that, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we'll find that rates of drug use among people of other ages have also changed a lot. Now we know this because there are other survey efforts that include not just young people, but rather older folks as well. And probably the most comprehensive of these is the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, which is run by the government out of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and has been going from the 1970s up to the present. So roughly the same time period as has been going the Monitoring the Future survey. And in some respects they work similarly. National Survey of Drug Use and Health surveys about 70,000 people per year. They do a mixture of face-to-face interviews and also computer-assisted interviews, but similar to Monitoring the Future, they just ask about different levels of use for different drugs. Now here is a graph which summarizes some of the data from that time period, running from about the mid-70s to the early part of the 2000s, and you can see the rates of use for the 12-month prevalence of use, meaning have you used this drug within the last 12 months even once. And you can see for alcohol, for marijuana, and for cocaine, a pattern which is similar, roughly speaking, to what we saw in Monitoring the Future. That pattern being that the rates of use were relatively high in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, but then they fell into the early 1990s. Then there was kind of a rebound up to the early 2000s, and then a drop off into the mid to early 2000s. So that kind of sloping wave-like pattern is similar in this data as we saw in the data from the Monitoring the Future survey. It's also interesting to note that change, or those changes, those trends, are most pronounced for marijuana. If you look at the bars for cocaine, they are relatively speaking lower and they don't vary quite as much. If you look at the bars for alcohol, they're of course much higher, and although they vary somewhat, they don't vary as much. But the bars for marijuana vary quite a bit. The highs are high, the lows are lows. I think in some respects this reflects our country's generally shifting attitudes over the past few decades about marijuana. We'll talk about that a lot more in coming lectures, but I just think it's interesting to note that as compared to many other drugs, including a legal drug, at least for the folks who are over 21, the legal drug alcohol, our attitudes about marijuana shift, or have shifted quite a lot. So again, one of the questions we didn't get to last time was, what about drug use in other folks, older folks than just high school students? And we see, generally speaking, similar patterns. Perhaps not a great surprise. Another question we didn't really get to last time is, what about other drugs? Monitoring the Future focused a lot on alcohol, a lot on the familiar illegal drugs, things like marijuana, LSD, etc. What about other types of drugs, particularly prescription medications which can be misused or abused? Now in I think it was my first lecture, I talked a little bit about recent research on rates of overdose death associated with analgesics. Those are painkillers, especially painkillers which are opioids. They are one of a few different classes of medications which are commonly misused and abused, including stimulants, drugs like Adderall, anxiolytics, that's anti-anxiety drugs, drugs like Xanax, and again, analgesics. What's very interesting, and in fact rather disturbing, about rates of misuse and abuse of these drugs is that those rates have been rising quite steadily over the last couple decades. A number of different surveying efforts have reported on and tracked this change. One of the ones that I'm just most familiar with, because I looked at it the most recently, is some of the data published out of the Centers for Disease Control. And here you can see rates in terms of the sale of these different medications. It's not labeled here, but this is a graph of different medications. The rates of admission for abuse or dependence on these medications, and the rates of death from these medications rising over the last roughly sort of 1 decade, or it's actually a little bit longer than that, but the graph captures about a decade here. So increasing use of these medications and increasing problems associated with misuse of these medications, things like deaths or admissions for drug treatment. Again, this is just an interesting phenomenon. It's a disturbing phenomenon that's been going on for about 10 years or a little bit more than that. The numbers of deaths associated with the misuse and overdose of prescription medications of various sorts, but especially painkillers, now exceeds the number of deaths associated with using some of the more familiar illegal drugs, things like heroin and cocaine. So when people say drug abuse, when people say overdose on drugs, the image that sometimes pops into mind is of someone overdosing on a street drug like cocaine or heroin. That can certainly happen, and it's of course very tragic when it does. But what is sometimes not recognized, or at least not until fairly recently, is that those types of problems, including severe problems like death, can be and are associated with the misuse of medications. And just as a quick review, I know I've talked about this before. Misuse means, in this context, just use for reasons other than intended. Someone, for instance, might be prescribed a course of treatment with OxyContin for management of pain, and then that person might go on to abuse the drug, taking it to feel some of the high, pleasurable feelings associated with abusing an opioid. What's interesting about misuse is when people have studied misuse of these type of medications, there's evidence to suggest that misusing these drugs is associated with a lower perceived risks from these drugs. That is, many people imagine dangerous drugs to include things like heroin and cocaine, but think that medications, because they are sold at pharmacies and prescribed by doctors, are somehow safer to use than street drugs. And in some cases they can be, but in many cases they're not. In fact, in a future lecture, actually I think it's 2 lectures, I'll be talking a lot about how we judge risk associated with drugs. For the time being, suffice it to say that people sometimes mistakenly think that just because they got a drug from a pharmacy and it's made at a pharmaceutical company rather than in a basement chemistry lab, that this drug is necessarily safe, and certainly that's not the case. So one reason people may be misusing these drugs is they mistakenly think that they are low in risk, and for some that's just not true. Another reason that people may be misusing these drugs is that, generally speaking, people who are high in sensation seeking tend to abuse drugs of all sorts. Now, sensation seeking is a personality trait. Those of you who have taken a personality psychology class may be familiar with it, but even if you're not, you can guess from the name what this personality trait is about. It's about the tendency for people to go out and do risky or fun things. Folks who are high in sensation seeking might seek sort of exciting recreational activities like rock climbing or bungee jumping. People who are low in sensation seeking as a trait may prefer more quiet, safe activities. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, folks who are high in sensation seeking tend to be relatively more likely to use drugs of all sorts than people who are low in this trait. And that's true for the misuse of medications. It's true for other drugs as well. Okay, so again, we didn't talk so much in the last lecture, or I didn't talk so much about in the last lecture about other age groups. I didn't talk so much in the last lecture about this interesting, relatively recent phenomenon of increased rates of medication abuse. I wanted to talk about that today. I also want to talk a little bit about use of drugs among college students. What about college students? Hopefully you're curious about that. Hopefully, because you are college students, your peers are college students, or many of them I'm sure are, and for all sorts of reasons, we're concerned about the use of drugs among folks in this age group, in your age group. Well, you won't be surprised, I don't think, at this point for me to tell you that there is yet another surveying effort. There are actually a number of different groups and research organizations that survey and study college students. One of the ones I'm most familiar with, one that I've had a little bit of contact with, is the Core Institute survey. This is run out of Southern Illinois University and has been going from the early 2000s up to the present, so not quite as long a period of time. Each year, Core surveys about 50,000 college students and asks them about their use of drugs and alcohol, their attitudes towards drugs and alcohol, etc. Now, I'm somewhat familiar with this group because, and you may be too, because Core conducts surveys on North Dakota State University. So it's possible you've even completed surveys for this organization about your own use of and attitudes towards drugs and alcohol. So they provide a fairly rich data set of information, albeit information that's relatively recent in history, not like these other surveys stretching back for decades and decades. Like these other surveys, when Core does their surveying, when they ask their questions, they typically look at things like the rates of use of different drugs. Here I've just popped up some summary statistics for the 12-month prevalence of use for marijuana and the 12-month prevalence use for drugs other than marijuana. We see probably a kind of an obvious, maybe not all that surprising finding that marijuana is a relatively popular drug as compared to other illegal drugs among college students. Roughly 1 in 3 college students will have tried marijuana at least once within the last year, but only about 1 in 10, a little bit more than that I suppose, will have tried an illegal drug other than marijuana during the last 12 months. If we go to the 30-day prevalence, that is looking at people who are more regular users who will report having used within the last month or so, that difference or that discrepancy still holds up. We see marijuana maybe 20% or so, 1 in 5-ish college students will have tried marijuana within the last 30 days, but it's less than it's less than 10% of students will have tried illicit drugs other than marijuana within the last 30 days. So a finding here similar to what we've seen in other data sets. The important idea being that these rates of use are roughly similar when we're looking at illegal drugs, and including marijuana, as to the rates we see among 12th graders in the Monitoring the Future survey. So if you stop the video right now and look back at the notes from the last video, you'll see that those numbers I just showed you from the recent Core survey are about the same as what we saw among high school students, or at least 12th graders, in the most recent Monitoring the Future survey. Not a great surprise, because really there's not a lot of difference between a 12th grader and a college student in terms of age, or in some cases in terms of attitude. Another interesting or important idea is that marijuana is still the most popular illicit drug among this group, and that's generally speaking true among many different age groups. So to put this in context, what about college students? Well, their drug use is similar to the use of drugs among 12th graders. Again, not a big surprise given their relative ages. What is interesting, or maybe especially interesting about college students and worthy of some attention, is their use of alcohol. So a lot of attempts to survey college students, including the Core Institute survey, focus a fair bit of attention on alcohol because, as you almost certainly know, alcohol is quite a popular drug among college students. So for the next few slides, I want to talk a little bit about alcohol. But before I get there, I want to step back quickly and look at the alcohol use among high school students just to give us a little bit of a comparison. So here we are again looking at high school students from Monitoring the Future survey data. And if we look at the past 30-day use of alcohol, meaning have you used alcohol within the last month, what we sometimes call current use, at least among this age group, we see that back in the 1980s, or say very early 1980s, there's a relatively high percentage of 12th graders were reporting having used alcohol within the last 30 days. Again, it's that late 1970s, very early 1980s period where drug use, generally speaking, was at its peak. By 2014, that rate had dropped considerably. If we look at binge drinking, which as you probably know is usually defined as drinking about 5 drinks or more within one drinking session. How we define a session is a little bit vague, but let's just say that within any one instance of going out drinking with your friends or drinking at a party or indeed drinking by yourself, if you drink 5 drinks or more, you're a guy, or in some surveys 4 drinks or more in a row and you're a woman, that's called a binge. And again, we see in the very early 1980s, fairly high percentage of 12th graders were reporting having binged on alcohol within the last 2 weeks. So relatively recent binging. That rate dropped considerably by 2014. So high school students historically have used alcohol and have even binged on alcohol. Those rates, generally speaking, have fallen quite a bit over time. Here's a graph looking at the 12-week prevalence of binge drinking from Monitoring the Future. Again, we're looking at high school students here. You can see among the 12th graders that general decline in binging over time. Now let's compare that to college students. If we look at college students, here we're looking at the Core Institute survey. If we look at their current use of alcohol, in 2006 and 2013, the rates are relatively high. In the past 30 days have used alcohol. Upwards of 70% of students in the last few years that we've done surveys will report having used alcohol within the last 30 days. If we ask how many people have binged in the last 2 weeks, those rates are pretty high as well. Upwards of 40 or 50% of students who are in college will report having binged on alcohol, having consumed 5 or more drinks in a row within just the last 2 weeks of time prior to being surveyed. So the important idea here is that unlike other drug use, alcohol use is much more common among college students, especially alcohol use that involves binge drinking. And probably you don't need me to tell you that. Probably you don't need a fancy and expensive survey to tell you that. But it is true, and it is interesting to look at that comparison between high schoolers who may be only a year or 2 younger and college students who may be a year or 2 older, who are very similar in their use of other drugs, but very different, or at least fairly different, in their use of alcohol. It's also worth noting that 62%, again this is in the core survey, 62% of underage college students report consuming alcohol in the last 30 days. So although we often think of alcohol as a legal drug or illicit drug, of course it isn't really legal, at least in most ways, not legal for young people to have, including college students. So many of those college students who are drinking fairly regularly, or indeed who are binging fairly regularly, are essentially using a drug illegally. They're using a drug that society at large thinks they shouldn't be using. Okay, last time we did, or I hope you did, I suggested that you do a little bit of practice thinking about developing a theory. We tried to speculate on or develop a theory as to why marijuana use, rates of marijuana use have changed over the decades. Let's use some of those same skills or engage in some of that same practice now and try to develop a theory for why alcohol use is so much more common in college or in university than it is in high school. So if you're watching this video now, just take a minute or two and think to yourself, what's so different about college as compared to high school that might account for differences in rates of alcohol use? Well, you may have come up with a number of different possible explanations, a number of different possible theories to address this issue or to explain this phenomenon. just a couple that I suppose you probably came up with were things like availability. Perhaps alcohol is just much more available to college students, and thus they feel more able to drink it. High school students would drink as much as college students, but maybe they just don't have enough access to alcohol. Another thing, or another potential explanation or potential theory you might have come up with is maybe there's something different about the attitudes or the kind of the culture of college students as compared to high school students, and perhaps that explains why there are differences in the rates of use of alcohol between these two different groups. Maybe you came up with other potential explanations. If you did, good for you, but these are two of the ones that students commonly come up with, the ones I came up with when I was writing this lecture, so I'm going to explore them in the next few slides. Let's look at availability. Now, clearly, people at college have access to alcohol. College students may go to private parties where people can serve alcohol without requiring students can find alcohol without having to have an identification to buy it or to go to a bar. Students who are in a university can have older friends who are allowed to purchase alcohol because of their age, and that makes it easy to get alcohol. And in many college towns, the laws around carding people or checking ID at bars or at clubs or at liquor stores can be relatively lax in enforcement. So it's a complaint you sometimes hear among administrators or faculty on college campuses that we have laws on the books in our state or in our local area to require liquor store owners or bar owners to check everyone's ID and to prevent young people or underage people from purchasing alcohol, but those laws are sometimes ignored or only enforced in a very loose way. So all of this could contribute to a difference in availability such that folks who are in college have much more access to alcohol, and that makes it easier for them to drink a lot more. Now, I'm not trying to say this is entirely untrue. There's probably some truth or some validity to this basic idea. But it's also worth noting that alcohol is fairly available to high school students, at least based on what they tell us. Here's data from Monitoring the Future, and one of the questions that survey asks students is for their perceived perceived availability of different drugs. How easy is it for you to get this drug? And here we see a graph that charts the perceived availability of alcohol among high school students. And we can see that almost 100% of 12th graders who answer this question over the last couple decades have reported that alcohol was available to them. Perhaps not as available to them as it is to folks in college, but not difficult for them to get. If I was to show you a graph of the perceived availability of LSD or cocaine or many other drugs, these lines would be much, much lower. For most high school students, alcohol seemingly is fairly easy for them to get. So merely noting that there's a difference in the availability of alcohol between college and high school students can't fully explain the discrepancy between their rates of use, because in fact college students have access to alcohol, and apparently high school students do as well. So this idea of using availability as a potential explanation suffers a little bit based on the data that we have available to us. So let's move on. Let's look at that next potential explanation or possible theory. And that is that there are differences in attitudes among high school students as compared to college students. And this is complicated because, of course, attitudes can refer to a variety of different beliefs that people have. Here, what I'd like to focus on is the type of beliefs or attitudes that students have about their own drinking, so your beliefs about your drinking, and specifically your beliefs about the types of negative experiences or risks and the types of positive experiences or rewards that go along with alcohol. So I might have a certain set of beliefs or attitudes about what happens to me when I drink, the good stuff that is likely to happen, and maybe the bad stuff as well. We can also talk about people's attitudes or beliefs about other students drinking. So I have attitudes about my own alcohol use, and I also probably have attitudes or beliefs about other people's alcohol use. And we'll see, I think, in the next couple slides that those type of beliefs factor into, or at least seem to factor into, the types of alcohol use that we actually see in college students. So moving on, I'm going to step backwards briefly to talk about high school students again. Hopefully this isn't confusing, jumping back and forth between them. But just quickly, I want to note that in the monitoring the future data, if we ask students for the perceived riskiness of engaging in binge drinking, the question here is, do you think binge drinking is associated with great risk to you? We can see that most high school students, a majority or a near majority of high school students will report that binge drinking is fairly risky. They have a high perceived risk of binge drinking. If you think back to the last lecture, you'll remember, I hope, that perceived riskiness seems to play a role in drug use. When people think a drug or a way of using a drug is fairly risky, they tend to be less inclined to do it or use it. When people think a drug is fairly unrisky, they may be more inclined to do it. So the point here is that high school students see binge drinking, well, at least some high school students, at least half of high school students see binge drinking as fairly risky. Now, the reason I'm highlighting that now is that when we look at college students, we see a similar picture. About half of college students say that drinking 5 or more drinks in a row, that is binging, is risky. So on the Core Institute survey, there's a question that asks, how risky, or do you think this is risky, drinking 5 or more drinks in a row? And about half of college students will say, yeah, that's risky. There's some danger involved in doing that. So both high school students and both college students see that personally, when you binge drink, there's some risk involved. At least some of them do. What's also interesting, though, is that if you ask high school or college students, as the Core survey does, about their beliefs about alcohol, their attitudes about their own drinking, you'll find that they tend to report that it is helpful to them, or that it has some value, especially value in terms of how they socialize. So I should say, on our quizzes for this class, I'm not going to ask you to remember any of these numbers precisely. I'm just putting them up here to give you a sense of how large they are. An overwhelming, or nearly overwhelming majority of college students report that alcohol is useful for a variety of social purposes. So 74% of students think that alcohol helps people to break the ice, or it helps them to have better social activity, or to connect with their peers, or to bond with members of their same gender. So what's interesting to me, and I think interesting to many people, is if you look at college students, you see that many of them, maybe a little less than half of them, will report risks associated with alcohol, but many of them, the majority of them, will report rewards, or at least potential rewards, especially social rewards. Similarly, we'll see when we ask college students that they fairly, a fair majority of them will report that alcohol is something that is fun to do. Drinking alcohol is fun to do. It gives people something to do, it gives them an activity, it gives them a way to have fun. So the point that is hopefully clear here is that although many college students will identify drinking, at least binge drinking, as a risky behavior, many students in college will identify it as a fairly positive behavior. And clearly that balance of risk versus reward tilts in the direction of reward for using alcohol, at least for many college students. So that's kind of beliefs about one's own drinking, how valuable it might be for me, personally to drink, or how valuable you might see it for you to personally drink. But we can also look at attitudes and beliefs that students have about other students drinking. And here, on various surveys, including the Core Institute surveys and other ones I haven't mentioned, when we ask students about what they think of other students drinking, we fairly often see responses indicating that most students think that drinking is just part of college life. It's something that students around them generally do. It's part of the culture or part of the experience of being in college. Not everyone thinks that, but a majority of college students do. People who work in the area of social psychology or sociology sometimes talk about these types of attitudes that we have about other people as norms, that is, expected behaviors within a group. So, within a group that you're a part of, maybe your cohort of college students, or a religious group that you're a part of, or a sports team that you're a part of, all sorts of groups have norms or have guidelines for what is typical for behavior among members of that group. Some of these norms are explicit, like rules that a group might have for how people should behave, but many of them are implicit or kind of unspoken, maybe even somewhat unconscious. And an idea that emerges from a lot of social sciences research is that norms, that is, beliefs that we have about how the people in our group ought to behave, those norms influence how we behave. In an extreme version of this, we might talk about peer pressure. If I believe that all the other people in my group are doing a certain type of behavior, I might feel pressured to conform to that norm. But those effects of norms can also be somewhat more subtle and may not be even obvious to the people themselves who are responding to them. So when we ask students about their beliefs about other students' use of alcohol, we find, like I've already said, most students think that other students around them drink quite regularly. So on the Core Institute survey, about 88%, again a really whopping majority of college students, think that the average student drinks at least once a week. Now this is actually sort of interesting because if you look at other surveys and ask students about their own use of alcohol, we find that the real rate of alcohol use is maybe about 20-30% of college students are drinking on a weekly basis. It varies somewhat in terms of whether you're asking underclassmen or upperclassmen, or it varies a little bit depending on which universities you're looking at. But what's important to note here is that the reality is that most students are not drinking on a weekly basis, but most students think that other students are drinking on a weekly basis. So most students have essentially a flawed or mistaken perception of what other students around them are doing. And as I've kind of already noted, students report that there's a social reward associated with drinking for themselves. They also generally report that alcohol is associated with the social lives of others. So if you ask students on the Core Institute survey or on other surveys, how important is drinking not so much to you personally, but to other people around you, other students, an overwhelming majority of students will say that it is central, that is to say very important, to the lives of other men or to other women. So there's a little bit of a gender difference there, but not a big one. Most people think, regardless of their own drinking, that drinking is really important to other college students. So some important ideas here. Most high school and college students don't use alcohol regularly. That is, at least not daily, or in some cases not even weekly. But when they do use alcohol, many of them use it heavily. This is the phenomenon of binge drinking. Students in high school, students in college, relatively few of them drink a drink every day or a couple drinks every week. What is more typical is that they'll drink rarely, but when they do drink, they'll drink very heavily, having 5 or more drinks in a row, having a binge. And that's important to us because, well, it's an interesting phenomenon just in and of itself, but also for reasons that we'll get to later in this semester, binge drinking is associated with many of the problems that come up with alcohol use. If you were to drink in the course of a week 5 drinks, but you had 1 drink on each of 5 days, it's relatively unlikely that you get into any trouble, either in terms of your health or in terms of your behavior, etc., etc. However, if you drank all 5 of those drinks in one setting, maybe on Friday night, you could easily get yourself into trouble. I think we all kind of understand that this binge drinking phenomenon, for good reasons, arouses interest among researchers and concern among clinicians and healthcare providers. Another important idea. Most high school students and college students associate alcohol use with risk. They recognize that there are risks associated with this drug, especially if you're binge drinking on it. They also, especially college students, identify rewards, social rewards associated with use. And the important thing here is that these associations, which we sometimes call beliefs or attitudes or expectancies, are related to actual alcohol use. I haven't really gotten into it yet. I will try to later in the semester, but basically there's a very large body of research suggesting that if you hold positive expectancies about a drug, you believe that good things will happen to you if you use this drug, you are more likely to actually go out and use it than if you hold negative expectancies about a drug. Probably not a great surprise to hear me say that, but it's true, and it holds for many drugs, including alcohol. And perhaps especially for alcohol, because alcohol, for most people, especially most college people, is a social drug. And all of us, almost all of us, want to socialize. We want to be part of the group. We want people to like us. We want to like other people. And to the extent that we believe alcohol helps that, we may feel inclined to use alcohol, even use alcohol in ways that could be dangerous to us. Another important idea is that most college students think most other college students are drinking regularly, and that drinking is an important part of college life. Kind of like what I just said. There's this social value to the behavior of drug use, behavior of alcohol use. And as I've said before, beliefs about how much other people are using alcohol, the norms about alcohol use that you hold for your group, are related to alcohol use itself. Again, the funny thing, or you might almost say the ironic thing here, is that many of the norms that college students hold about alcohol use, their beliefs about the use that other people are engaging in, are flawed. People in college often overestimate how much other people are drinking, and then might feel mistakenly inclined to up their own game, to drink more because they're trying to chase what they think other people are doing, even though for some of them they're just wrong about that. Okay, so lots of ideas here. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. I hope that this makes sense to you. Of course, if it doesn't, please leave some comments or questions in the discussion boards online. Also, please do this. Reflect on your own experiences. Think about the concepts that we've covered so far in these lectures or in your readings. In the future, as we go forward, think about these concepts, definitions, ideas that I've discussed, and see if you can make connections in your own life. Now, you may not use a lot of drugs, you may not drink alcohol, that's fine, but think as best as you can based on your own experiences of your own life or people you know. Does what I'm saying make sense to you? Do you think it's the case that the type of attitudes that we hold about our own drug use, positive versus negative expectancies, actually influence choices we make? Has that happened to you? Do you think that norms about group use of drugs, how much people tend to drink in your social group, have influenced your behavior in terms of your drinking or your drug use, or the behavior of people you know? Maybe you'll find that there's a good connection between what I'm saying and what you're experiencing in your life. Maybe not. Either way, reflecting and making those connections, or trying to make those connections between what you learn in class and what you can see in your own life, is, I think, very important to do. I think it can be very fun or interesting to do, and I think it will help you to remember this material better. Students sometimes ask me in some of the classes I teach, how can I study for the test, or how can I study for the quiz, or whatever. It's hard to answer that question because, of course, studying techniques vary, and what works for one person might not work for another. But generally speaking, what works for a lot of students is to try to find elements within what they're learning that connect to those students' own lives. What in this book, what in this lecture, what in this presentation or project can I fit into my own life? Once you make those connections, you'll find that things are easier to remember and hopefully more meaningful. And that's really the whole point of education anyway. So think about your own experiences, and hopefully you'll get some value out of learning, and it'll be easier and more fun. Okay, preview for next time. Now, I've hinted at this a few times, or I've previewed it already, but basically in the next few lectures, we're going to talk about how bad drugs are, how we judge how bad drugs are. And I'll ask a question that may seem sort of silly or even too obvious. Are drugs a problem? And that question, as is often the case, leads to other questions, particularly the question of how do we decide whether a drug is dangerous or problematic, or how do we compare drugs and decide which one is more dangerous than the other. In the next lecture, I'll talk about one way we can get at those questions, and that is looking at the toxicity of drugs. But in lectures following that, I'll look at other criteria or other ways that we can evaluate the dangerousness of or the problematicness of drug use. So again, that's what we're getting to next. For the time being, though, thank you for your attention. As I always say, thanks for your attention, and if If you have some time to step outside and relax for a little bit, please do so. It's a beautiful summer, at least up here in Fargo it is. I hope that it is where you are too. And when you're done resting and thinking about this stuff, come back and I'll be ready with the next lecture. Thanks. Bye-bye.